Welcome. Today, we're diving into a story that feels more like a dark prediction of the future than a present-day reality. We are talking about Iran, a nation of over 92 million people, a civilization with a monumental history, and a land rich in resources. Yet, even this major power is arguably facing the greatest civilizational crisis it has seen in centuries. For decades, the Iranian government has found itself in a state of continuous confrontation, suffering setback after geopolitical setback. Its declared top enemy is Israel. Its overseas proxies, which it spent billions of dollars and decades building up, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Assad regime in Syria, have all been either effectively crippled or completely destroyed. This has, for the first time in decades, exposed the Iranian heartland to direct hostile foreign attacks. U.S. and Israeli warplanes have subsequently been able to relentlessly and, crucially, with impunity, bombard the country's sensitive military and nuclear research sites. To the north, an American-mediated peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan threatens to establish a continuous corridor of NATO and Turkish influence across Iran's border, blocking off the country from maintaining a direct land corridor with its Russian ally. To the east, the volatile Taliban regime in Afghanistan is resulting in unpredictable and violent border skirmishes. In response to accusations of collective disloyalty and spying for Israel, Iran has begun the forceful deportation of millions of undocumented Afghans. But despite all these colossal external challenges, the greatest modern threat hanging over the very existence of Iran is not geopolitical. It is internal and ecological. In the near future, Iran may very well become the first major modern civilization to run out of water for its own people. Given the size of the nation and its population, this is a colossal problem, not just for Iran itself, but for the entire world. The severity of the situation has become acutely visible, even in the seat of power, the capital, and the nation's largest city, Tehran. The city is home to roughly 10 million people, about 11% of the entire country's population. And yet, Tehran consumes about 1/4 of all of Iran's water reserves. Typically, 70% of Tehran's water supply is provided by a system of dams and reservoirs nearby: Amir, Kabir, Lar, Milu, and Latian. But as of September 2025, all 4 of these reservoirs are at critically and unprecedentedly low levels. The normal annual rainfall for Tehran is about 260 millimeters, but in 2024, the capital only received a fraction of that, 140 millimeters. Preliminary estimates for 2025 project an even more catastrophic rainfall level: just 100 millimeters. These reservoirs around Tehran usually hold an average of 618 million cubic meters of water. But in 2024, reserves had already shrunk to 485 million, and as of September 2025, they have depleted even further down to 258 million cubic meters. This means that half of Tehran's stored water has vanished in just 1 year. The Latian Dam Reservoir, which normally holds about 95 million cubic meters, has shrunk by over 90%, and now contains only about 9 million cubic meters. Furthermore, decades of chronic overuse have begun to deplete and destroy the city's underground aquifers. This has led to rapidly accelerating ground subsidence. Tehran is currently sinking by several millimeters per year. In the summer of 2025, the water crisis reached such a peak that the Iranian government was forced to implement full, half-day water shutoffs across the capital. This was combined with electricity blackouts due to heat and increased air conditioning demand. As early as late 2024, the government was demanding that offices, schools, and even banks close on certain days to conserve energy. Officials warn that, without consumption cutbacks, Tehran might be forced to adopt a 4-day work week during the peak summer demand period. Currently, the government has already imposed water rationing, cutting off household water access for 3 to 6 hours a day. In some cases, water pressure has become so low that it fails to reach the upper floors of high-rise buildings, forcing residents to carry bottled water or buckets up to their apartments. The crisis in Tehran has escalated to the point where the city's long-term habitability is being questioned. Authorities have even announced a study into the feasibility of relocating the capital to another site with fewer water and infrastructure issues. The incumbent president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, has publicly proposed moving the capital south, closer to the Persian Gulf, to be nearer to strategic trade routes. Unfortunately, the water crisis is not unique to Tehran. This is a problem facing the entire country, from north to south and east to west. Reservoirs are drying up, and lakes are disappearing across the nation. In early October 2025, the Iranian regime's own state news agency, IRNA, reported that 19 of the country's largest reservoirs were on the verge of total desiccation. 3 of them, unnamed in the report, had already reached 0% remaining capacity. Over half of all dams nationwide are filled to less than 40% of their total capacity. Lake Urmia, once the largest lake in the entire Middle East, located in northwestern Iran, has almost completely dried up, leaving behind only a salty, dusty crust. Over 280 cities nationwide are experiencing extreme water stress. For instance, the city of Yaz completely ran out of water in March 2025. For nearly a week, the city had to be supplied entirely by water trucks and bottled water until the main supply could be restored. Rural communities have been hit even harder. Hundreds of villages are now completely dependent on tanker trucks after their wells ran dry. Cities are literally sinking as their underground aquifers are completely exhausted. Cracks are appearing in the railway lines connecting major cities. Some Iranian officials are already warning of a looming day zero in Tehran and other cities, the day when the taps for millions of people could run completely dry. The situation has become so bad that hostile external actors have started to capitalize on it. In August 2025, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a video message directly appealing to the Iranian people to rise up against their situation. He stated, "Iran's thirst for water is matched only by its thirst for freedom. As soon as Iran is free, Israel's leading water experts will come to every city in the country with the most advanced technology and knowledge to help Iran with water recycling and desalination." While Netanyahu was absolutely the wrong person to make such an offer to the Iranian people, he was correct that the water crisis has become the regime's greatest strategic vulnerability. The crisis is exacerbating the country's already complex ethnic divisions. Minority groups accuse the regime of prioritizing water access for the Persian majority. And at the heart of it all is a complex history of governmental corruption, bribery, terrible policy, climate change, and geopolitical intrigue that has brought Iran to the brink of water bankruptcy. To understand how a nation arrived at this point, we need to go back in time. The story begins in the late 1942s, when Iran was still ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1949, the Iranian Shah visited the city of Las Vegas in the United States. His purpose was to study the engineering marvel of the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, which created the massive reservoir, Lake Mead, and allowed the desert city of Las Vegas to survive and thrive. The Shah wanted to modernize his country, and the construction of monumental dams and reservoirs in Iran's similarly arid climate was of great interest to him. He returned from the Mojave Desert with a new ambition and technical assistance from the Truman administration. American engineers brought in modern irrigation and drilling technologies that allowed Iranian farmers to begin draining their ancient aquifers at an unsustainable rate. Iran has a very uneven distribution of water resources. A narrow strip of land in the north, near the Caspian Sea, receives an average of about 280 millimeters of precipitation per year, similar to rainy New York, and this area is dense green forest. However, in the center of Iran, the heart of the Persian people and the southern lowlands, annual precipitation rarely exceeds 100 millimeters. Furthermore, the rainfall here is extremely seasonal, falling between October and March, leaving the land dry for most of the year. The Shah and his engineers chose to modernize Iran and redistribute water availability through dams and water diversion. However, he also ordered the construction of water-intensive industries like petrochemical and steel plants in the driest parts of the country. The Persian region, on the Central Plateau, in places like Isfahan and Fars. This tied the fate of Iran's heavy industry to areas with no significant water reserves of their own, making them over-reliant on water diversion from other parts of the country. Later, in the early 1962s, the Shah implemented a land reform that broke up large feudal farming estates among smaller farmers and families, encouraging a shift towards mechanized farming. But this led to the destruction of the traditional irrigation system that had existed for millennia, the qanats. Qanats are essentially underground aqueducts that the Persians perfected over thousands of years to transport water across the arid and hot Central Plateau. However, these qanats, which supplied Iranian cities with water for countless generations, began to be abandoned in the early 1960s. The new peasant farmers widely switched to motorized deep wells to access the underground aquifers. The problem is that the water stored in them is finite and takes thousands of years to naturally recharge. The process of moving away from traditional water management towards new, poorly understood technologies had begun, but it would rapidly accelerate to wildly unsustainable levels after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the Shah and installed the modern theocratic Islamic Republic. Following the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis, diplomatic relations between Iran and the U.S. collapsed. The United States imposed a trade embargo that has lasted for decades. This restricted the country's access to the mechanized equipment and spare parts on which agriculture and irrigation had relied since the time of the Shah. At nearly the same time, in 1980, Iraq launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, triggering the devastating 8-year Iran-Iraq War. Food and resources were rationed across the country. The theocracy's first supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, began advocating a policy of radical self-sufficiency and food sovereignty. In a rush to achieve this goal, he ordered a radical expansion of dam, well, and agricultural infrastructure. Before the 1979 revolution, there were fewer than 80,000 wells in the country. But in just 3 years after the Ayatollahs took power, that number doubled. At the same time, hundreds of new dams were planned, most of them centered on the arid Central Plateau. After the protracted war with Iraq ended without a clear winner in 1988, the regime's private army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was suddenly left without a clear military purpose. The government, under then-President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, found a new purpose for the IRGC, branding it as the Jihad of Reconstruction, retasking the IRGC with construction and development to maintain their influence and morale. A new IRGC-run engineering firm called Khatam Al-Anbiya Construction Company was established, quickly becoming the regime's favored contractor for building dams, tunnels, and other water diversion projects. Another company, the Iran Water and Power Resources Development Company, IWPCCO, was founded as a state-owned design firm by regime insiders. Also founded was an incredibly influential and opaque consulting and lobbying firm, also run by regime insiders, called Mayhab Goats. All three of these companies were effectively run by the same people, tightly connected to the regime, and they formed a closed loop with no outside scrutiny or balance. IWPCCO would design and commission dam projects, often based on old, outdated Western blueprints, and rarely factoring in environmental studies. Mayhab Goats would lobby the government for their approval, and Khatam Al-Anbiya would immediately receive the no-bid contracts to actually build the projects, protected from any political oversight. This network of IRGC and regime insider-run companies eventually earned the moniker of the country's water mafia. The rapid expansion of dam and water projects came to be seen as a source of personal enrichment, rather than a national good. Over the next few decades, the water mafia built hundreds of dams across the country, usually without any environmental assessment or long-term planning. Water from rivers was diverted to feed IRGC-owned factories, businesses, and heavy industries, at the expense of agricultural and municipal water supplies, to further enrich the insiders. One of the most infamous water mega-projects undertaken by the Islamic Republic after the Iran-Iraq War was the 550,000 project, initiated in 1,996 inches, the western provinces of Khuzestan and Ilam. Vast tracts of land were confiscated by the government, and the Karun River was diverted to feed industrial farms controlled by regime-linked insiders. The massive Gotvan Dam on the Karun River was completed in 2011, despite environmentalists warning that huge salt deposits would form if it were built in that location. As predicted, once the dam's reservoir filled up, it began to leach salt into the river, sharply increasing salinity levels downstream. This caused tension among the Arab minority in Khuzestan, heightening their resentment toward the non-Arab-dominated regime. All attempts to seal the salt layer have since failed. This has left a massive salty lake in the reservoir behind the dam, which is steadily choking and killing much of the natural irrigation water supply downstream in Khuzestan, one of Iran's most productive agricultural regions. Despite the IRGC's water mafia being the direct cause of this ecological catastrophe. They were profusely enriched by the estimated $3.3 billion construction cost of the dam. By 2012, 316 dams had been built in Iran. By 2018, in just 6 years, that number had more than doubled to 647 dams. Many of the country's most water-intensive industries, such as nuclear sites and steel mills, were built in the Central Plateau for strategic defense purposes. The consequence of this is that these industries are located very far from open water, forcing them to intensively use the country's limited rivers and aquifers, only accelerating the drawdown of already scarce resources. The Zayanderud, the largest river on the Central Plateau, has been so heavily diverted to water-intensive steel and petrochemical plants, as well as to other provinces, like Yazd, that it is now merely a seasonal mudflat and regularly runs completely dry. This has critically lowered the primary, natural water source of Isfahan, the country's third-largest city. Lake Urmia has almost completely dried up after dams built on its feeding rivers choked off its water supply and its ability to recharge. This has resulted in heightened dust storms, worsening respiratory illnesses, and increased migration from the region. Simultaneously, the irrigated agricultural land area around Lake Urmia more than doubled following the 1979 Islamic Revolution from 300,000 to approximately 700,000 hectares today. The problem is that the Lake Urmia catchment basin only provides about 4 billion cubic meters of water a year, and the proper irrigation of all the farmland created around the lake today requires anywhere from 4.5 to 5 billion cubic meters. Unable to get all the water they need from the region's rivers, desperate farmers, often illegally and without permits, began to bore wells deep into the underground aquifers. These same processes, which are draining Iran's aquifers, have been happening nationwide for decades. Farmers, denied access to rivers by their diversion for IRGC-linked industrial purposes, have resorted to widespread and often illegal well drilling to make up the shortfall. From 2002 to 2015, the number of registered legal wells in Iran nearly doubled from 460,000 to 794,000. And it is believed there are tens of thousands of additional illegal and unregistered wells. Recent studies based on official statistics place Iran as the 5th highest in the world for the rate of groundwater depletion. Of the original 500 billion cubic meters of ancient, fossil water stored in Iran's underground aquifers, roughly 200 billion cubic meters are already gone forever. Most of the remaining 300 billion cubic meters is salty, rendering it useless for agricultural irrigation. The depletion of the groundwater has become so catastrophic that, despite a 50% increase in the number of wells in the country over the last 2 decades, the rate of groundwater extraction has actually fallen by about 10% over the same period, simply because the reserves are running out. To put the scale of this into perspective, while Iran's population is only about 1% of the world's, it is responsible for roughly 9% of global groundwater extraction. As a result, half of Iran's aquifers are rated as being in a critical state, and 6 of the country's largest cities, including the capital Tehran, are among the world's top 43 cities suffering from the highest rates of ground subsidence. The global critical threshold for ground subsidence is 4 millimeters a year. In many parts of Iran, the current rate of subsidence is exponentially higher, around 10 centimeters a year. And in some places, it reaches a staggering 31 centimeters per year. In Tehran, the water table has fallen by over 12 meters in just the last 2 decades. But perhaps no other city in the country has suffered from over-extraction of groundwater as much as Isfahan. Over the last few years, Isfahan has been extracting an average of 1.1 to 1.2 billion cubic meters of water from its aquifers, mainly for agriculture. This has gone on for so long that a 2-3 billion cubic meter void has opened up beneath the city, spanning an area of roughly 2,700 square kilometers. Put simply, a void, roughly 10 meters deep, exists beneath much of the city, causing huge subsidence problems. As of September 2025, 9 major subway stations, 274 fire stations, 328 mosques, 37 libraries, 3 major hospitals, and 258 schools in Isfahan are located in areas with exceptionally high rates of subsidence. At least 40 schools have already been evacuated, and many have been deemed structurally unsound and demolished. What makes it worse is that the water infrastructure built throughout the country is absurdly inefficient by global standards, compounding the already severe water supply. Agriculture. Up to 90% of all usable water in Iran is expended on agriculture. And this is despite agriculture making up less than 12% of the country's GDP. Irrigation efficiency. Irrigation efficiency in Iran, the percentage of water actually utilized by crops, is catastrophically low, only about 30%. For comparison, neighboring Iraq and Turkey maintain rates around 50%. Leakage. Iranian cities on average lose between 25% and 30% of their municipal water supply, simply due to leakage, mismanagement, and aging infrastructure. Developed nation cities average under 10%. International financial sanctions and trade embargoes placed on Iran for its nuclear program and regional terror support have severely restricted the country's access to modern program technology, blocking critical water infrastructure upgrades. The regime often blames sanctions for the infrastructure decay, but after a significant portion of the sanctions was lifted following the nuclear deal during the Obama era in 2015, the regime simply poured nearly all of the extra funds into even more dam building and water diversion projects that enrich themselves, instead of making real reforms that would help mitigate the crisis. Because of all this inefficiency and reckless use of water for mass agricultural production in pursuit of self-sufficiency, Iran consumes roughly twice the amount of water annually as neighboring Turkey despite having a comparable population. As a result, per capita water availability in Iran has plummeted since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In 1979, per capita water availability was estimated to be about 4,500 cubic meters per year per person. In the 2020 seconds, it is estimated to be only 1,000 cubic meters per person per year, a quarter of the pre-revolution level. The regime's policy mistakes are compounded by the rate of climate change, which is hitting Iran harder than most other nations. Iran, being a hot, dry land to begin with, is becoming even drier and hotter. Over the last 3 decades, Iran's average temperature has risen by 1.8 degrees Celsius, roughly 4 times the global average rate over the same period. The country has been in a state of near-continuous drought for 5 years since 2020. During that time, annual precipitation in the country has decreased by 30%. All of this lowers the ability of the country's depleted rivers, lakes, and aquifers to naturally recharge, and the situation is only set to get worse climatically. Even if Iran enacted the necessary reforms to curb water overconsumption, there is little they can do in the face of a warming climate. Projections forecast a further rise in average annual temperature of 2.6 degrees Celsius and a drop in annual precipitation of another 35% over the next few decades. Ironically, Iran, one of the world's leading oil producers, is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, yet, simultaneously, one of the most vulnerable nations to its effects. Renewable energy makes up less than 1% of Iran's total energy mix. The rest is oil and gas, making Iran one of the highest per capita emitters of CO2 in the world. Adding to the regime's mismanagement, international sanctions, and climate change, the neighboring nation of Afghanistan is making matters worse. The Taliban is actively choking off the water flow into Iran. One of the great rivers flowing into Iran is the Hari River, which begins in Afghanistan's mountains and then becomes the international boundary with Iran and Turkmenistan. The Hari River is the primary water source for Mashhad in northeastern Iran, the country's second-largest city, home to over 3.5 million people. Since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in 2021, they have been aggressively constructing a new massive hydroelectric power station, the Pashdan Dam. Iranian authorities fear that once completed, it will cut off Mashhad from the Hari River's water supply, further compounding the crisis by requiring a diversion of Iran's already strained water reserves toward Mashhad. Iranian state media has already warned that the filling of the Pashdan Dam, which began in 2024, has led to the near-total drying up of the downstream Friendship Dam reservoir, which is shared between Iran and Turkmenistan. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that the Khorasan province, where Mashhad is located, has become the driest of all of Iran's provinces in terms of precipitation deficit. Afghanistan has never signed a treaty with Iran or Turkmenistan regulating the water flow on the Hari River. So, the Taliban claims they can do whatever they wish with the river's waters upstream. However, Afghanistan and Iran did sign a legal agreement regulating the water flow on another major river to the south, the Helmand River. After decades of failed negotiations, Iran and Afghanistan signed the Helmand River Water Treaty of 1973, which guaranteed that Afghanistan will pass at least 820 million cubic meters of water annually down the river into Iran. Soon after, however, a communist revolution took place in Afghanistan in 1978, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran the following year, preventing either side from focusing on the issue for decades. Since then, both sides have periodically accused the other of breaking the agreement. But after the Taliban returned to stable power in 2021, they almost immediately, despite the treaty, began choking off and diverting the river for their own purposes. A key example is the Kamal Khan Dam, which the Taliban recently opened in February 2025. Afghanistan itself has also been badly affected by drought and climate change, leading the Taliban regime to claim they have no choice but to reduce the water supply to Iran to meet their own needs first. With the completion of the Kamal Khan Dam, Iranian officials stated that, for the entire year of 2025, they only received about 100 million cubic meters of water down the river, a tiny fraction of the treaty guaranteed 820 million cubic meters per year. The ecological consequences were immediately obvious. The Hamun wetlands in Iran, fed by the Helmand River, have almost completely dried up. This has led to dust storms, the collapse of regional agriculture, and more internal displacement. The Taliban's actions on the Hari and Helmand rivers are compounding Iran's water crisis and fueling rising tensions between the two countries. In 2023, Iranian soldiers and Taliban fighters briefly clashed at the Helmand River. As of 2025, Iran is attempting to pressure the Taliban by undertaking a massive deportation campaign of Afghan migrants and refugees. Iran claims the deportation campaign is linked to their unfounded accusations that the Afghan community within the country was acting as spies for Israel. But the real reason is a desperate attempt to force the Taliban to release water down the Helmand and Hari rivers. As a side benefit, this also reduces the number of people they need to supply with water. In just 1 month, Iranian authorities have forcefully deported roughly 1 million Afghans. The UN has called it potentially the largest forced displacement of people in a decade. The total Afghan population in Iran before this campaign began was about 4 million people. Iran has stated its intent to eventually expel all of them. This means that, right now, Iran is in the process of deporting millions more people, further heightening tensions with the Taliban. The consequences of all this combined have put Iran on the brink of catastrophic water bankruptcy. And this is exacerbating one of Iran's greatest vulnerabilities, its ethnic divisions. Iran is an ethnically very diverse state, composed of a core of Persians in the center of the country, on the Central Plateau, and a ring of various ethnic minorities around its borders and periphery. These include Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, and Arabs in the west, as well as Balochis in the southeast. In the southeast, the critical reduction in water coming down the Helmand River is fueling the cause of Balochi separatism, where a violent insurgency is growing and becoming harder for the government to contain. In Khuzestan, west, Arab communities accuse the government of prioritizing the Lurs by diverting the Karun River, which flows through their territory. They also blame the government for the salinization of the Karun River due to the misguided construction of the Gotfan Dam upstream in neighboring Lorestan, which is home to the Lur minority. In Lorestan, the Lur community itself often accuses the government of stealing their water for the nearby Persian city of Isfahan through diversion projects like the Beheshtabad and Koran canals. In the northwest, the disappearance of Lake Urmia has sparked tensions between the Kurdish and Azeri minorities, who historically shared the lake and its resources, which are now lost. Should the country's water crisis continue to worsen, it could easily push these ethnic frictions to a breaking point. At this time, the Iranian regime has proven itself completely incapable of offering any real solutions to the crisis. The Iranian Ministry of Energy has proposed a grand plan to build desalination plants along the Persian Gulf and Caspian Sea, linked by an extensive pipeline network. The desalinated water is to be routed to the most stressed interior regions, such as Isfahan, Kerman, and Yazd. However, this construction project will cost untold billions of dollars and take many years. The regime has neither the funds nor the time to adequately implement this. Rampant corruption within government circles means that any investment in these projects is almost certainly going to be pilfered before it even begins. The real solutions that Iran desperately needs to implement are internal reforms that rein in the country's rampant water overexploitation. These include asterisk, actually enforcing limits on the number of wells in the country, asterisk, cutting subsidies to farmers who favor water, intensive crops like rice, asterisk, abandoning the idea of complete agricultural self-sufficiency, asterisk, redirecting the billions of dollars they spend annually on proxy forces and regional conflicts toward fixing the domestic problem, asterisk, and above all, reallocating water use away from heavy industry and toward public and municipal consumption. All of this represents a colossal fight against the deeply entrenched interests of the IRGC and regime insiders, who are immensely profiting from the current system at the expense of literally everyone else. And despite all the catastrophic water problems, the country's regime is still prioritizing the expenditure of enormous resources on rebuilding its nuclear weapons program. Just days before this information was made available, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian stated that the country would rebuild its nuclear research facilities, which were destroyed by US and Israeli bombing, stronger than ever. At the same time, the government has provided almost no commentary on resolving the ongoing water crisis. The water crisis in Iran is not merely an environmental problem. It is a catastrophic overlay of policy failure, corruption, geopolitical conflict, and climate change that has turned a great civilization into a cautionary tale of how human hubris can dry up a nation's future. The fate of Iran on the brink of day zero serves as a grim warning to the world. When the water runs out, everything else, the economy, the politics, the social order, and even national security begins to crumble right alongside it. This is a story of how water became the most precious, most scarce, and most explosive resource in the modern world. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what surprised you the most in this video, or what you found the most fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Many more thrilling, shocking, and mind-blowing stories are coming soon.